It's nice to see in the program Father Andrew's going to talk about Father Andrew's going to talk about enculturation and things like that. I just wanted to say a few words to introduce him and to have you thinking and put your thinking caps on for the conversation. We've mentioned a lot today about things touching on culture. Starting with Father Barnabas mentioning Orthodox phronema, the mindset, our thinking, our thoughts, how that brings us towards being hospitable to others. And certainly culture is a way that brings people together. It can also be a way that pushes people apart. And so the challenge there is that when we are dealing with our culture, we are dealing with it from a perspective of Christian love, from a perspective of welcoming and hospitality. And if we are, as we have been told to do, reaching out to make disciples of all nations, particularly the one that we live in, we should be looking at what it means, what parts of the culture can help us to make more disciples, what parts of our Orthodox phronema, our Orthodox culture can be helpful to bring those people in, but also what part of Australian culture, acts, effects, things that have happened in our years that can make that, and make that easier for us, bring down barriers and help us. So with that, Father Andrew Smith, please come along and
Thank you very much, Father, for your kind words. Probably the main thing that I hear when I was saying I'll do a talk on the commonalities, the common ground between Australian culture and Orthodox Christianity is the bemusement that there is an Orthodox culture, a Australian culture at all. And it's probably something that can only be said by someone who is so ingrained in Australian culture that they don't know any different. It's a subtle thing. But like all culture, it's typically seen best in contrast. With other cultures. You may notice on, I forget which page it is, you might have to bear with me on that one. 52, you'll see the structure of tonight's talk. So when I start talking about things like the Alaskan Missionary Quadrilateral, when I start listing trilateral, thank you. When I start listing historical events, it'll make it much easier if you go, yes, this is it in order. And what I'd like to do with tonight's talk, my success standard for tonight's talk is going to be that we can define enculturation. We'll see the necessity for enculturation, for Orthodox evangelism. We'll know what the Alaskan Missionary Trilateral is. We'll be able to identify cultural practices and values of contemporary Australia, the Australia that we live in. We can demonstrate how, at least one, but maybe others, elements of how contemporary Australian culture can be implemented in a parish setting. And we can begin to categorize elements of our culture based on that trilateral. So the first part is, what is this enculturation thing anyway? Why should we? The answer is perhaps more basic than we want to give it credit for, because that's how we received it. We received not just a faith disembodied, but a faith from a context. Now this was as true in the first century as it was in the 800s, in the 900s, as it is to us today. It comes out of a culture, whether it's ancient Near Eastern or otherwise. The reality is that to go to a new people, a new group, there is a barrier there. There's differences. They may be good differences or bad differences, and it really doesn't matter. The fact is that there are differences. Linguistic differences is only the most obvious. If I start speaking to someone and they they start speaking at me, and we're not speaking the same language, there's no way that we can communicate. Not easily. Google Translate can get us part of the way. I guess many of us found that out today. But it won't get us all the way. And it won't get us to the point where we can be having the kinds of heartfelt conversations that are really needed for the work of evangelism, for the work of sharing the hope that is deep within us. Linguistic is one, different languages, different classes, different ages, different genders, and different cultures is what we're referring to tonight. So when we're crossing that cultural barrier, and when we're putting the gospel into the context of a different culture, that's enculturation. Some will use the word contextualization, basically the same idea. Bringing the gospel into a new culture. This is what happened for Acts 15, that Council of Jerusalem that said that converts didn't have to be brought into the old covenant before they were brought into the new. This is what happened when the Apostle Paul brought the gospel to the Gentiles. Even to those people, that is us. It's what St. Justin Martyr did when he wrote the Apology to the Roman Empire, co-opting a Roman form of communication for the preaching of the gospel. It's what the Celts did when they had Iona and Lindisfarne, bringing the gospel into the various Celtic cultures. Is what the Slavs had beginning with St. Cyril and Methodius, where it wasn't expected that Slavs would be Byzantine Greeks. It was anticipated that Slavs would be Slavs, and there were alphabets invented for the purpose. It's what we saw with St. Ansgar of Scandinavia, St. Stephen of Perm, St. Makari of the Altai, St. Innocent of Alaska. It's what we saw with Metropolitan Innocent Figurovsky of Beijing, St. Nicholas of Japan, as Father spoke about earlier today, St. Tikhon of Moscow, many of whose quotes you will see in the booklet in front of you, and what we saw with St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco. And it must not be forgotten, Western Europe was his see for quite a long time, a lengthy enough time that he was able to devote part of his time to collating the local saints who were just as much a part of our faith, just as much a part of our cloud of witnesses as any other saint in our synaxarium. So tonight, what we're talking about is nothing less than how the Orthodox Christian faith may be incarnated for the peoples of Australia. To do that, we'll use something that I think was perfected in Alaska, certainly brought to the form that we know so well. And what they used was that we celebrate the good. We don't throw it out just because it's not us. If their culture is already good, fantastic. We will celebrate these good parts of their culture. If there are things that are contradictory, then we will reject it. There is no question that morality or ethics dies on the mission field. This isn't evangelism anyway, because evangelism is the good news, and this would be a perversion. So we celebrate the good, we reject the bad, and thirdly, we transfigure the redeemable. The example in this particular context, there's the concept of, it looks like totems, which sounds problematic. But the missionaries who went to Alaska learned what they were. These were memory guides. These were memorials to something in the past. And this we can receive. This is no different to a statue of King George on a horse that we might find in the CBD. Well, this we can transfigure. It wasn't all about what can we receive, what can we transfigure. There were practices that had to be refused. Polygamy was an accepted practice. And within a generation, this was put to the side. Accepting Christianity meant one of those, you could choose, one of those was your wife in every sense of the term, and the remainder you were still responsible for. They didn't break the social fabric of the society. You were still responsible for their upkeep, and if they wished to marry another, they were able to. And within a generation, Christian marriage reigned in Alaska, across Christian Alaska. So we celebrate the good, we reject the bad, and we transfigure the redeemable. So we have that basis, what is enculturation, and how might we do this? Now, what is Australian culture? How is it that we can define this? How is it that we can put words to this? It's challenging. I certainly found it challenging. Firstly, how do you define any culture? And then, what about this one, in which I know that I've lived in pretty much all my life? I don't think holidays count as an exception after all. And moreover, in one particularly small geographic area of this nation. But with that preface, let's do our best. How is it that we define our culture? Well, through things like place, our geography, our history, the stories that we tell, not just the timeline of events, but what that timeline means tells us a lot about our culture. Who are the culture shapers, who have been the culture shapers, rather? Who are the archetypes? How do we look? What do we celebrate? What do we eat? How do we speak? And our values. Each of these defines what it means to be Australian. And we can start, I think, from the least contentious part of that, and that's our geography. We have a very particular geography because we've been so geographically isolated for quite some time. So when we look at depictions of Australia, representations of Australia, what do we look to? Kangaroos, emus, a galah. We can see kookaburras and koalas. Wattle. The first national celebration was focused on wattle. That's pretty cool to celebrate a plant. Says a lot about Australians, doesn't it? That that's what we choose. The vastness of our country is such a thing that it became part of how we speak. We talk about the outback. An incredibly small word. When we say that something is outback, we should be just referring to the shed. In fact, we're referring to most of a continent. We talk about something being beyond the black stump. We talk about something being back of Burke. We talk about going walkabout, which is a very Irish thing to do. If you look at their history of monasticism, very Irish thing to do. But we certainly made that our own. And the sound of the Australian bush of cooey wouldn't be necessary if we could just see each other. It's the fact of that bush that makes that such a ubiquitous term. And of course the places in our country. Where do we go on holiday? We go up the coast and down the coast. We might go bush. That's kind of it. And once again, we might go out back. The places in our country can be very, very close, just down the road. I can drive an hour and a half and get to Toowoomba from here, and it'll be on the same street the whole way, and it's an hour and a half away. Just down the road. Not very convincing. But our place is big in our identity. Our history Of course, history and geography, necessarily related. Our history is very important, especially for the parts that we highlight. Things like, well, let's start first with Indigenous Australia, the 500 different people groups that lived here across this great big dusty continent, and the 250 plus languages, the roughly 800 dialects. And these are just our best estimates, but they're not half bad estimates. Then we have European discovery, first by the Netherlands and probably most significantly by Captain Cook. We have colonization in the First Fleet, the frontier wars, the missions to the indigenous. Then in the 1800s, we have our main concept was that we're Britannia's faraway sons across the sea. We saw a lot of, well, when I was at school we called it explorers and discovering Australia. Now we know that to be a very Eurocentric concept, but it was European exploration. We can say that much. Because they saw themselves as European who were over in the Asia Pacific. But they were Europeans in this country. Whether it's Blaxland or Hume or Oxley, Burke and Wills, possibly the most well-known, Sturt, Eyre and Stirling, each of these played their part in discovering the continent from the perspective of the Europeans who came here. We had the gold rushes, significant for our identity once again, whether in Victoria or Western Australia. And of course we have our rebellions. Both the Rum Rebellion, fascinating history, it didn't have much to do with rum, but it did overthrow a governor. Whether it was that or perhaps more well known, the Eureka Stockade. These are all parts of our identity. Then the early 1900s came about, and who are we became a really dominating question. Who are we as we seek nationhood, as we seek this federation of states? Who are we? And we received this federation, this identity as the Commonwealth of Australia, probably before we had that uniting story. Our identity, at least as far as we see it, was formed at Gallipoli, and formed with the idea of brave Australians led by incompetent Poms. The Gallipoli and the Anzacs are central and vital to how we see ourselves. Simpson and his donkey, one of those archetypal stories where we will go into danger for a mate. Then in the mid-1900s, there was a pivot away from Britannia and a pivot towards America, a little bit towards the Asia Pacific, but much more towards the United States. That forged during the Kokoda Trail and in the what's called the Battle for Australia. Not on, but for Australia, which was mostly in Southeast Asia. And then soon after, the nation building that occurred, the populate or perish, so-called populate or perish scheme, where many, many people were facilitated to move to Australia from various parts of Europe. But many, many people were brought here under this scheme, under this idea that Australia needed more people to exist as a country. The Snowy Mountain scheme is, I think, the most well-known part of this. Then the late 1900s came about. Probably the bicentennial caused us to ask a lot of questions about ourselves. Just before that, we had the Australia Acts, where we were actually cut off from England. There were no appeals to the Privy Council and so on. The bicentennial. After that, East Timor, where we had an identity in the Asia Pacific, and the Sydney Olympics. And lastly, with multiculturalism became such if not in practice, then certainly in desire, position that we wanted to take as a nation, or rather a position that we did take as a nation. And part of that being the Mabo decision, that this wasn't terra nullius, as opposed to how Australian history had thought of itself for the couple of hundred years prior to that. Then in the 21st century, it's always difficult talking about history when you're part of it, but we are part of it. So in the 21st century, we have a socio-cultural realignment where things don't go nearly as swimmingly as we wish that it did. Whether it's with the race tensions, with the Tampa incident and the Cronulla riots, the socio-political shift that we've seen with the postal referendum, the anti-confession laws, and the weakening of the religious basis of many of our private public institutions. And then this one is very, very difficult to analyse, so I've chosen not to, but it ought to be listed. The social trauma that has come about in the last couple of years. Our history has a lot there. Our archetypes are going to be something that I'll speak about soon, but they come very much out of our history. What we celebrate is a big part of our culture. A big part of any culture is what it celebrates. Do we celebrate a war in our foundation? That's a very, very different thing to a civil war. And it's a different thing, again, to freedom from slavery. For us, we take World War I and Gallipoli in particular as being our foundation. Now, researching this, I found some thinking maybe we shouldn't. Isn't the fact that we're able to have an independent nation in peace, and not war, isn't that worth celebrating? When it comes to our mythos, of course, we do have the Anzacs, and Australia Day, we have it as a public holiday. I know there's debate about the date, and that I'm not entering into that. The fact of celebrating one's nation is something that's universal, the day itself being unique in Australia. We have the Easter long weekend, a difficult one because the main thing that's celebrated culturally on the Easter long weekend is the long weekend. We have Anzac Day, which really is celebrating how we perceive our founding story to be. We have the birthday of the sovereign, or however that's called now. Because it's going to be tough not to say Queen's birthday, isn't it? We have Labour Day, out of the success of the 8 hours for work, rest and play movement. And the day of the local fair. So in Brisbane we know this as Ekka, because exhibition was just too long to say. And various other places will have their equivalent as well in celebration of the local place. And lastly, in our public holidays, we have Chrissy and New Year's. Because what are we celebrating at Chrissy and New Year's?
There's drinking again.
Hangover recovery, presents, public holidays.
No work.
And I suppose that we can all hear the silence being deafening, that there's no mention of the birth of Christ. Yeah. It's not just because it's a new calendar, old calendar question. That's very niche. But our culture doesn't see that as a reason for the sacred. For better and for worse, each in their own way. But it is a challenge for us. How is it that we sanctify time? We have other things that we celebrate in our culture, for better and for worse. We have Valentine's Day, we have Reconciliation Week, Mother's Day and Father's Day, I mentioned a second ago. Very important to celebrate Father's Day specifically and Mother's Day specifically. Are You OK Day? And Remembrance Day. There are other cultural festivals. Schoolies. You all know it to be true. Movember, yeah.
The priests do November.
Started, never stopped. State of Origin and the footy grand final.
Oh, you forgot cricket, mate.
No, I didn't.
Boxing Day.
So there's a lot of days that are significant for our culture. And it's what we celebrate that gets passed on in our culture. Our dress, we can probably see this just by looking around. Broadly Western standards of dress, the idea that shirt and pants or dress or skirt are good things. Latitude heavily defines our standards of formality. If you're in Cairns and if you're in Melbourne, you have very different standards of what should be, what is the dumb thing. I think the people laughing have been to both and going, yep. I remember being asked, do we really have to wear a tie to church? And I forgot to ask where these people were coming from. And I'm going, no, I wouldn't think so, being pure Brisbaneite. And then someone else responded, well, you know, for me it's just about being respectful. Then I worked out, they're both from Melbourne. It's a different context. Your weather is going to hugely define what is good and what is insufficient to be worn. Your place will also define your footwear of choice. Are you choosing boots? Or are you choosing thongs? That's flip-flops for any non-Australians watching the video. And which one you choose probably reflects where you would rather be. You want to be in the bush with your Iron Williams, or at the beach with those flip-flops. And if you're in the big smoke, your preference probably indicates where you would rather be. Where do you go to on holiday, or want to go to on holiday? Class is something that we so much have overtly. It's denoted very, very subtly. So it's one of those things that's probably a little subtle for tonight's talk. The latest research tells me that there's 7 classes. The established affluent, the emergent affluent, the established middle, the mobile middle, the new workers, the aging workers, and the precariat. The last one of those, precariat, we'll talk about a bit later, because that is something somewhere where we, the church, are able to speak into. Our English language, broadly the same. There's a broader accent. There's your Steve Irwins, your general, which is most of us, and your cultivated, which is your Geoffrey Rushes. You've got regional variation, but surprisingly a small amount of regional variation. Adelaide folks will have a distinct regional accent, but beyond that, it's mostly found in using slightly different words to describe the same thing. What are our values? One of them I already mentioned, this value of mateship, what we might call egalitarianism, the idea that everyone is equal. Now, we just talked about how there's actually 7 classes, but let's leave that to the side. That's not part of how we view ourselves. We view ourselves with a very flat hierarchy. That each man is as good as any other man, each woman is as good as any other woman. We refer to each other as mate, as cobber. We would say good on ya to people. We would say my shout because, well, we take turns in buying everyone whatever beverage we're having. And of course, we're all about the fair go. These idioms tell us something about our culture. They tell us what we hold to be most dear. Adaptability. All the way back from the Gallipoli campaign, when allegedly the retreat happened by jam tins and weights that would set off gunshots so that there was no suspicion that there was an evacuation. This adaptability, no doubt influenced by being in the bush where there was no one within Kui. So fundamental again. How central it is that no worries is to us. That she'll be right, that we should have a burl, that we should have a go, or have a go yamag. I think that one's gone out of fashion, but it's still there. No, it hasn't gone out of fashion? Okay. Very, very anti-arrogance and the perception of arrogance, and that again comes out of that egalitarianism. We're not a big fan of seppos. Tall poppies are an issue. Got to cut them down. The ponds just keep on wedging. Canberra is our favourite place to bash. Sorry, Canberra. And we just love saying our yeah nahs. But no, yeah, it's real important that this is said. And it's an anti-arrogance thing. It doesn't convey, I know this and you need to listen. It says, yeah, I've considered what you have to say and this is how I'm responding. That's where yeah nah comes into its own. Our tall stories, I don't know if they're famous, but well, if one of us starts telling a tall story, then the rest of us just can't help piling on. Work, I know we've got this laid-back image. We also have a lot of sayings around hard yakka, do a bodgy job, that dobbing on someone is just not on. Chucking a sickie, on the other hand. And I think wagging might be a Queensland-specific idiom. No? That crossed the border?
Yep.
Good. It's a champion word. And of course, luck. So coming back from the gold rushes, we got this idea. The phrase, the lucky country, was originally said ironically, as in, oh yeah, the lucky country. And we just took it on as, yes, this is the lucky country. What else would it be? So we have that idiom, and of course the famous Chucker Bradbury, where we just succeed because everyone else failed first. Who is it that are our writers, our artists, our people of culture? So how many people are you going to list on my list? Some of them you're not going to like, but some of them you will. You'll hear Banjo Patterson and kind of be reassured. Henry Lawson, Dorothea McKellar, who wrote about loving a sunburnt country. Steele Rudd. Then we have our comedians, which I'm not expecting us to love. But our very, very Australian comedians go from the satire of Clark and Dorr, John Clark and Brian Dorr, to Roy and H.G., all the way through to Barry Humphries, the late Barry Humphries, through to Effie from Acropolis Now. Our artists, Pro Hart, Albert Namachira, inspired changes in global art. Musicians, so there are a lot of bands from Australia, but if you're looking for Australian music, then you'd be hard-pressed to go too far past Slim Dusty, Paul Kelly, Archie Roach, Nyoka Yundi, Cold Chisel, and The Seekers. All right. How do we take that, put that against the Alaskan missionary trilateral? Because in all of that, we're accepting the good, rejecting the bad, and transfiguring the redeemable. Some of this is going to be a lot easier. Some things are just clearly good, and we can accept them. The things we're going to talk about, where we live, what we do, how we interact, and how we see ourselves. So, where we live is the first one, our geography. Floral symbols and animal symbols. Self-evidently, we won't be seeing a kangaroo in the backyard, at least not most backyards in the city. Getting more and more specific as I talk about that, aren't I? we can see floral symbols and animal symbols incorporated into our liturgical arts. And we have seen this in various places. If you're very observant, at the two St. Nicholas churches in Woolloongabba, that's the cathedral that we'll be in on the weekend, and in the Serbian church, that's just in the opposite direction. That way? Or that way? Somewhere that way. Either way, you can see kangaroos on the frescoes. Already that's being done. You would be able to incorporate wattle and gum and jacaranda, bottle brush. I'm told this is popular in other parts of the country, blue leschenalthia. Can someone please tell me if I pronounced that correctly? Is that a South Australia or Western Australia thing? Must be Western Australia. But there's many of our flowers that are able to be incorporated just like any other flower.
We've got a jacaranda tree in one of our frescoes at Ross Street.
That's right, it is a great big jacaranda too.
That fresco is a good example because it's the St. Nicholas Defender of Brisbane.
I agree, it's very, very good. The animals, kangaroos, emus, koalas, kookaburras, galahs, and many, many more, depending on the context. And this also has been done. Likewise, the Saint Sava blessing the children icon, you see up in the tree, you see a koala there. In our liturgical arts, we can have this in vestments or in other embroidery, bookmarks, for example. We could see this in iconography, as we've discussed. We can see this in logos or coats of arms. We can even see this in the idioms that we choose to use. Grace flowed like the Murray-Darling is probably a little forced, but not too much. And I don't think it would take long for us to have some others that flow. Next, what we do. How is it that this is able to be accepted? Well, one of the things that we can accept happily is the desire to explore, the desire to go walk about, to go on that quest. When we look to this exploration, we can be talking about encouraging the exploration of the Orthodox faith. The exploration where we find orthodoxy and go searching like Blaxland, Wentworth and Wilson. Where just as they found, we also may find. Don't use Burke and Wills for that, by the way. That's not a good story. They didn't make it back. Our adaptability. Because whatever frontier we find ourselves on, we'll find God there as well. That, as St. Paul says, He is not so far from each one of us. This isn't something where we need to go to some particular holy site far away and we're just on the wrong side of the world. Because He came to save the world, not the top half of the world. He came to save the world, to save the people here. Our adaptability means that we know that things might be subpar now, that they may not be optimal right now, and that they will get better. We can accept and celebrate the fairness, the egalitarianism that's a part of who we are. We proclaim being the church that Christ founded. This is also a responsibility. We must act like it. We must act like it, which means to welcome the outsider as a brother. Long lost, but nonetheless. To welcome the outsider as a fellow child of God. The volunteerism that Australia basically made famous worldwide at the Sydney Olympics. This volunteerism, well, it needs to come across. It needs to come across into our parishes and our communities. We need to be involved in our church. We also need to welcome newcomers to be involved alongside us. That, either one of those can be a stumbling block. Sometimes it's both. But either one can be, where someone's eager to help, but they're not doing it right. This is not welcoming the newcomer as a newcomer. We don't welcome them tepidly, we welcome them fully to do and expand the work of our Lord here on earth. Our remembrance of the departed at Anzac Day, at Remembrance Day, especially Remembrance Day, that's a particularly straightforward one because we're not talking about cycles of Easter and whereabouts Easter falls in relation to Anzac Day and are we able to do memorial services. Remembrance Day has none of that, so we're able to bring that straight in. Lastly, our connection to the land, our connection to country, as it might be put. Now, even if we're living in the big smoke, we still identify with other parts of the country. So one of the ways that we can work with this is to encourage the so-called harvest festivals, where we bring fruit in to be blessed at church, to encourage this in our parishes. Transfiguration has this, blessing of fruit. Dormition, if memory serves, has this with blessing of herbs. It is I'm not sure if standard or common, but either way, practice in our diocese that the blessing of fruit occurs 6 months earlier, because this is a seasonal thing, and it happens at presentation when fruit is brought in and blessed. Why? Because we offer our best to God. We offer our best, and from there we're able to share that with our brothers and sisters who share that celebration with us. How it is that we interact. We have our mateship, and this is a word that we use a lot, yet we somehow know what it means. It's used even to describe what is a military value. In our armed forces, they see mateship as a military value. That's how fundamental it is to who we are as people, or how we see ourselves. And taken to its fullest, it's not so far away from brothers and sisters in Christ. If someone's your mate, then they've got your back. There's not a lot of difference between that and brother in Christ, sister in Christ. That includes our newest brothers and sisters, whether children or whether adults who are newly illumined. And we welcome them fully as brothers and sisters in Christ. How we interact is to be a good part of our psyche. I know you're thinking of that neighbour who chucks a party every Friday night. Sadly, that's all too true sometimes. But the reason that we get so uptight about it is because we're expecting them to be good neighbours. When we take that as part of who we are, it's to be hospitable, to be welcoming, to be helpful to those around us. We've talked a lot already about welcoming your visitors. I won't talk further about that, because I think that we have heard enough to put into practice eagerly and joyfully. Welcoming them with food and drinks, whether that's tea and coffee and Vickies, or whether that's barbecue and soft drink, to welcome your visitors. And if you can contribute to the surrounding neighbourhood, to do so. If your church up and vanished tomorrow, would your neighbours notice? If they don't, something might have gone wrong somewhere. That and or, we have work to do. Our multiculturalism is a big part of how we interact, or ought to interact. And what we do, we welcome, understand, and celebrate the cultures that are in our country, the cultures that are in our community. That means actively including those people and their ways. Tangible means of welcoming include encouraging their food. It includes learning something of their language. Can we learn Christ is risen and truly is risen in the languages of our parishioners, of our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ that we see every week? Subtle welcomes include diversity in iconography, and I'm speaking here of do you have different backgrounds represented? Do you have, yes, you have the 12 apostles, yes, the New Testament. Are there people from Slavic countries? Are there people from Western Europe? People from Asia? People from Africa? One of the sayings that's become a lot more well-known recently is that you can't be what you can't see. There is some truth in that. The truth in that, well, if we can see that people who look like me became saints, that means that we can be saints. It's more evidence, not just intellectually, I know that we can because we're human. But someone who looks like me can be a saint. Someone who came from the last century can be a saint. It's not just on people on pedestals from 1,000 years ago. We can too. This might be a challenging one. Subtle welcomes also include not particularly caring about how guests dress, because they're your guest. They'll pick it up, don't worry. It'll only take a couple of weeks. But you want them coming back for the couple of weeks. How we see ourselves includes our archetypes. So these historical archetypes are things like swaggies, like the jolly swagman. Not a great story, that one. I'm kind of okay with that not being our national anthem. Just read the lyrics. The bushy, like that man from Ironbark. The bush ranger from the Kelly Gang. The digger for the Anzac. The larrikins, like Paul Hogan. The wowsers, like clergy and preachers. This isn't good, by the way, but I'll get to that in a moment. But at least we've got a name. The crooks. The best example I could find, Christopher Skase. Yeah, see? Absconded with millions and then managed to live in Portugal or something. And the battlers, like that movie, The Castle. There's also a bunch of other people, like the top blokes and the surfies and the bogans and the derros. All sorts of archetypes we've got in our country. There was a gentleman who produced a book, and I think it was his doctorate thesis probably, that talked about the spiritual archetypes. What does it look like in our culture to offer guidance to someone? And he found 6. And he used our history to do a lot of that. Spiritual companions for the journey. These are things like soul friends, the people who are walking beside you. You're able to have that connection because they're not demanding anything. They're saying, maybe consider this. The chaplains for convicts, this one isn't great. Mostly moralist wowsers with this one. It can be for other settings as well, chaplains can. The definition there, we say how people ought to behave. Starting from behaviour, not a great choice. You start from theology and then behaviour follows. Shepherds for settlers. So this is where you have the top bloke. He's an upright and downright man. He's decent. He earns respect with practical compassion, inspiring through our life. Taking this archetype, we inspire through our life. And only then will people listen to our words. This is one we can really take. We can be advocates for the marginalised, which is a tricky one, but that prophetic voice. So this is distinct from wowserism. This is much more like John the Baptist, the voice in the wilderness, declaring truth to power. So it's not declaring truth at the little people, so to speak, not declaring truth at the battler, They've got enough to deal with. Declaring truth as power, going for the Herods of our society. To declare truth to power. Servants for the needy, people like John Flynn with the Royal Flying Doctors. That's that self-sacrificial servant leadership, giving ourselves for the sake of others. We have a fancy theological word for that, kenosis. To be loving someone kenotically is to be self-sacrificing for the other, self-offering. And lastly, hosts for a multicultural community. This is where hospitality fits as an archetype, where we're able to bring people together, where the cafe becomes a natural place for us to be, that we look after the other, that we look after the newcomer, the stranger, as Father Barnabas was talking about today with that word philoxenia, the love of the stranger, that we are friends, mates of the stranger, even if they don't know it yet. Now, there's some bad things here. Firstly, the Western Christian missions to Indigenous Australians. I don't know terribly much that was redeemable about most of what happened there. It was government-sanctioned Westernization. It's not what we're about. We weren't involved in those missions, the Orthodox Church. That's one of the perks of mostly arriving to Australia after the 50s, with some exceptions. Now, the problem there is that it cuts both ways, because in our context, we do the same as government-sanctioned Westernization. We do the same if we declare all Western culture as evil, or Australian culture as non-existent. This elimination of culture. Well, it doesn't matter who it's about. It's still wrong. Instead, we see the Alaskan missionaries as our exemplars, the defenders of their people against the brutality of governing authorities, often at great personal cost. Certainly not the instruments of the governing authorities. And this is what I was referring to much earlier, previous session, when I was talking about how the word mission itself is problematic in Australia. You may have noticed that on the communities and congregations tables that we were talking about, it mostly does talk about congregations and communities, because the word mission is difficult. We know what it means, but that's not who a mission is to. And it is an important thing. What else is bad? Well, the race tensions. That's not on. That's not what we have. We need all peoples, all cultures, and to be making disciples of all people groups. When we talk about Panda Ta Ethnic, we're talking about all the people groups. And we take that and unite as members of the Christian race, born of water and the Spirit. Lastly, the 21st century socio-political pivot. There are great problems with this. We can declare things to be immoral, but we can't just declare things to be immoral. It has to come with why. Why is this thing immoral? If we're going to be speaking to those who are not Orthodox Christians, and often if we're speaking to those who are, we need to explain why this thing is wrong, not just declare it to be wrong. If we think that we have a neat soundbite, we don't. There is a neat soundbite for this. It's complicated. And it requires knowing what the truth is, and also having the sometimes lengthy, painstaking conversations to still reinforce that we love the other person, whoever that other is, that we see them as brothers and sisters. And our representatives, any who would seek to be representatives, and any who are, must live out the teachings of our faith. Because nothing strikes worse than the smell of hypocrisy. Sorry, that wasn't the last one. There's two others in the what is bad category. The polarization that we've been seeing, that's not good for a community. That's not how a community runs well. To have people diametrically opposed, they can't even speak to each other because they are so at enmity. Your community is not long after that. It will fracture somehow. That can be repaired, and it ought to be. That can be healed, and it ought to be. But it's a warning. If that polarization comes from the political, from the 24-hour news cycle, into our churches, then we've brought in what is heterodox into how we live out the Christian life. And instead, we must learn to keep community without homogeneity. We're not all going to be of the same exact thoughts. We need to be united in our theology and heading in the same direction. To be gathered together and moving together. Lastly, that precariat class I was talking about, a group of people who are living hand to mouth, often because they're university students, but in many cases, they are trying to live that dream of, well, making a better life for themselves. This was a very normal thing, and more recently it's become that much more precarious. It takes one, shall we say, problem with their payroll system at their work. All of a sudden they're skipping meals. That is often how dire it can be. We are able to be speaking into that in our church communities. We are able, firstly, to see if there's needs in our own parishes, and then in our neighbourhood. This means that we need to be involved in caring for the least, wherever we are. Now, probably the most fun one is what can be adapted. It's a hard one. And particularly for this section, more than the previous two, these are going to be more on the lines of suggestions than anything close to declarations. So, the idea of gold rush luck. That things will work out, and instead we look to position ourselves well. We still need work in this. We still need to have to play our part. Rebellion can be difficult. This will tie into our notions of egalitarianism, because we do have notions of rightful authority in our church. We do have ideas that a person is in a place because they ought to be in a place, in a position because they ought to be in a position. And so these notions of rightful authority, that's going to be a tricky one for us to adapt. How it is that we can express disagreement while maintaining social harmony. And that's going to be something that will take adjustments all around. I know that a number of people have said to me from whichever context, it used to be that the priest would say this, and this was what it was. And I'm getting a lot of nods from various cultural backgrounds, which further affirms this. But I can tell you that that's certainly not the case now. It is not automatic that the guy who wears a cassock is boss. That these notions of rightful authority, for us, respect is very much earned. And only after it is earned does the respect happen. Before that, it's just being polite. How it is that we navigate this, Well, this will be one of the ways that we will need to have adaptations. The difficulty of our dress standards, as much as we want to be welcoming the outsider, well, once we've been coming for a couple of weeks, once we go, I want to make a home here, the perpetual, I'll start that again. If we are always casual, then what we're saying is that nothing is sacred. Now, this is a different thing from if we have one set of clothes or two sets of clothes. We're not talking about that. But if we're choosing to always be casual, then we're also choosing that nothing is particularly sacred. Nothing is set apart. And this is something that we Australians will have to come to terms with, individually and collectively. And of course, balancing that while avoiding classism, while avoiding unnecessary othering, is going to be important as well. We are able to conceptualize the spiritual life as in work terms. I've spoken in confession to a number of people conceiving prayer rule as in gym contexts. What do? Do you go regularly? You continue to work out. You work out when it's hard. In fact, when it's the most difficult is when the gains are happening. Well, the spiritual life is not the time for a bodge job. It's a time for some real hard yakka. This isn't something to wag. This is something to be a part of. This is something that gives the basis for the rest of our week. The difficult part of our creatives, our artists and writers, is that their common thread is, well, much the same. Whether it's Barry Humphries, or Effie, or Clark and Dorr, or NHG, is take a good, long, hard look at yourself. That can be real uncomfortable, especially since it's typically a mirror directed towards those ostensibly in power, as satire usually is. And yet this also is something that will need to be considered, will need to be adapted. How do we bring in our public holidays and our cultural festivals? Now, we've already identified that we won't bring in all, but what can we do? Well, Australia Day, notwithstanding the debate about the date, for the day when we celebrate our nation, or for the Sunday around it, possibly both, for that day, we can be having prayers for our nation. That can be anything from one of the prayer services, the Melebans from the Book of Needs, all the way down to a petition in the Litany of Fervent Supplications. This can be a part of what we do. Our Easter long weekend can have our Lenten services writ large. Rather than going, well, everyone's going to the beach, amp up instead. That this is worth spending your days at. For Christmas and New Year's, well, we've got Sierra's Youth Conference, we've got our teen retreat. I'm sure that we can do things at parish levels too. Would it be the case that after the fireworks, we take that opportunity to pray for this new year that we've just entered? Since we have the public holiday on the 25th of December, for those of us who are on the quote-unquote old calendar, celebrating St. Herman, celebrating St. Spiridon, it seemed very, very appropriate for us. When we have our memorials for Anzac Day and for other memorial services through the year, to include the names of those Orthodox Christians who have fallen in defense of this country, right up from the first AIF to now. To have red poppies in church decoration, to have Anzac biscuits at coffee hour. The day near the local fair can be one where we choose to pray for our city. Valentine's Day, yeah, I know, it's a lot of sop and treacle. But it is a time when we're thinking about couples. And that should be encouraged. Even as we celebrate also Saints Peter and Febronia Day. For both of these, because why stop at one when 40 will do? Isn't that what we do all the time? For both of these, we're able to have prayers for marriages, prayers for those looking for marriages. Perhaps we can have talks about dating, about marriage, about how couples are to be. We can have education on how marriage would be. Our Mother's Day, our Father's Day can respectively have these prayers for mothers, for grandmothers, for godmothers, and so on. Fathers, grandfathers, godfathers, and so on. We can have talks in support of and teaching about motherhood and fatherhood, womanliness and manliness, masculinity and femininity, respectively. At Reconciliation Week, reconciliation is a positive thing. That we are reconciled with God is a massive theme in the gospel. That we're able to be reconciled with one another, with our brothers and sisters in Christ, is a part of the first prayer. That we, what might an Australian Orthodox music sound like? Now, this is one where I'm I feel less competent to speak specifically on. And it probably won't happen because someone forced it to. But it will look like the music has been composed here. It will look like the hymns, say for those locally produced saints, have been composed here, have been compiled here. It may look like we have folk songs, songs that we sing together. It may even look like we have extra liturgical music. One of the challenges that I've had when thinking about this, when do Australians sing collectively? Football? The anthem, where we kind of start with the first line and then go with the vowels. Waltzing Matilda? Real short list, isn't it? It's not really something that we do, which I'm sure the fathers around the room can attest is a challenge when recruiting for your choir. How might our visual arts look? Well, not only will it look like will it be from here, it will include saints from all the flowers of God's garden. It will include saints who look like the peoples of the world. It will include liturgical decorations that look like they came from around here. The various flowers, the receiving and localizing things that come from overseas. There's a decoration, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it, the word rushnik, the idea of a long rectangular cloth. Many may be familiar with it in the context of a wedding. It's also used to decorate icons. So you have a cloth around the icon as a decoration. Now, it wouldn't take much to change the decorations into something that looks like and was produced here. And of course, church buildings. One of the stories of how church architecture happened in Russia was that when the Byzantines came, they built this gorgeous, expansive dome, and it didn't survive the snow. There's not a lot of snow in Constantinople. There's plenty when you go much further north. And because it didn't survive the snow, well, they learned real quick, we better change how we design roofs. Hence the onion domes, hence the much steeper ceilings, and so on and so on. Many other changes likewise. We too will need to consider, I live in Queensland, so I'll start with that. We live in Queensland, it's going to be hot here. Even the heat is hot. That's going to have impacts for your outside painting of your church. You're probably going to need to do it much more often than you would want to. And more things besides. You'll adapt to the weather and to the materials that are actually available. Some other elements before we move to the saints. Bells and calls to prayer. Now, I have a parish in a residential street. Looks like a house because it was. And if you think we're getting a bell tower outside, mate, tell him he's dreaming. But what could you have? Well, for now we've got a bell from Bunnings, which is nice. One of the photos, and I think one of our fathers on my right may have been there at the time. One of the photos that I remember was a greeting of, I think it was Bishop George in Gunning. And as some of you may know, this was the late Father Seraphim's church. And he was greeted with clapsticks. This is a very, very simple instrument. Looks like two thick drumsticks. You clap them together. It is literally what it says on the tin. And that was a way that he welcomed him. Now, it was a photo, so I have no idea the sound that it made. But I'm guessing that it probably sounded a lot like the talando that is used in the former Ottoman Empire liturgical traditions. Why? Because bells were forbidden there. What do? Well, the call to prayer might sound a bit different. It might sound more like this, instead of the bells that Western Christians, that Russian Orthodox, that many would be much more familiar with. Other elements, we know that many cultures have dance as a part of their culture. I have no idea how that comes into how that would come into this talk, but because the dances we have are YMCA, Macarena, and the Nutbush.
And the chicken dance.
And the chicken dance. Sorry, I knew I forgot one. How that fits into what an Australian and Orthodox culture looks like, I don't know. But it will be interesting to find out. Other post-liturgical adaptations. These are things like coffee hour, mornos and smoko, a barbecue. It's very, very natural things that we may not even think about. But it's it's the fact that we don't even think about it that makes it so deeply ingrained and odd when it's missing. Now, we don't have glorified saints yet. The possible exception is Father Nicanor, and I've found that it depends on whom I ask. So that's probably another story. But we do have role models. I want to run through a list of 10, and then we'll close the questions. This 10 would fit 5 of the categories of sanctity. We have apostles and missionaries, we have hierarchs, we have martyrs and confessors, we have monastics, we have the righteous. So first, Father Jacob Koczynski spent a lot of time in Queensland. He was a missionary sent for the Orthodox Christians who were living here, who were without a priest, except for this one guy who may or may not have been legitimately ordained, who was definitely schismatic, and who was extorting people for sacraments. And he came for them. Father Rostislav Gunn came out, lived in Sydney. I'm not sure if founded Cabramatta. Founded Cabramatta, including the enormous church building that is there to this day. Father Vladimir Yevsukov was at Melbourne Cathedral, who died early in a car crash. Metropolitan Filaret Voznesensky, who was the first hierarch of Rokor, but before that he was the Bishop of Brisbane. Elder Nicanor was probably first in line to be official, at the very least, and he left his bones here in a lane in Victoria. Father Schema Monk Guri Demidov, who lived in Kentland at the Skeet. He was an ascetic and lived there for most of his days until he couldn't. Archbishop Anthony Medvedev, who was the Bishop of Melbourne for a number of years. Bishop Nectarios Kellis, who served in Adelaide and the Gold Coast. He became a bishop and a missionary in Madagascar. Mitred Archpriest Michael Le, who endured all sorts of brutality under the Chinese Communist Party and their Cultural Revolution. And lastly, and I might be a little premature, but that's okay, Metropolitan Hilarion, our diocese and hierarch until about this time last year.
We have Not Bavara here in Cabramatta is very, a lot of parishioners view her as being an up-and-coming saint or at least someone who gave a lot back to the church.
And she was also around the same time as Father Rostislav.
Right.
And also very much a liturgical specialist. And so whatever she said meant. And we still have many local traditions in Cabramatta that have come from that time.
Thank you, Not Bavara.
Who is she?
She was an abbess, I think in Kentland.
Now, it is important that we do adhere to the Church's decision, or in this case, kind of non-decision, that they haven't been officially glorified yet. So we're not going to preempt that and write church services and serve them in church and things along those lines. But we do have the example of our brothers and sisters in Christ who chose to serve memorial services while they awaited glorification. This is something that happened quite a lot for St. Xenia of St. Petersburg, for St. John of Kronstadt, and at the time it was just Father John of Kronstadt. More current examples would be Father Seraphim Rose. An annual memorial was served along with a talk, and that was given as a Father Seraphim Rose Memorial Lecture in Sydney. Now, if we did this for the 10 people mentioned, we'd have one in March, 2 in May, 1 each in June, July, and August, 2 in September, and 1 in November and December. That's really, really well spread out throughout the year. And we would be remembering those who, at least to us, appeared to live a saintly life. We would be showing forth those who were role models, who are luminaries, candles in darkness. We all know what candles do in darkness. Darkness does not abide it. Now, we'll conclude here. The culture of this land is much like the culture of any land. There's much to welcome, much to rejoice in. There's some that, yes, needs straining, needs rejecting. And there is much that we may redeem, adapt, and transfigure. I know that the question is asked, what about an Australian Orthodox Church? But what we will see is this happening in our parishes first. That's where our focus should be. That's where our first focus needs to be. And may we find ourselves equal to the task of bringing Christ to the people who dwell in this land. Thank you all very much for your attention, and we'll open for questions. Thank you. Any questions from tonight's talk?
Where did the Australian culture to the Orthodox? Do you see it's something more organic or something that you have to do consciously? So like a balance between those two?
Bit of both. Bit of both. I think in some places it would need to be kind of conscious because you're breaking away from the established way of doing things. If your established way of doing things is this way, and you're, let's say, because we're talking about culture, let's say it's a particular, not just liturgical tradition, but people from a particular country, and you're wanting to say, and these people too, at the very least, you need to be able to make room for that, and that's a challenge. And that would need to be done deliberately. It's just encouraging. You're from X place, and do you know how to cook the cuisine? Because, I mean, you may not. Just because my ancestors come from a particular country doesn't mean I can cook at all, let alone their country's food. But sometimes the answer is yes. Wonderful. You know, whatever gifts you have to give, please present. That would be wonderful. So it doesn't have to be the massive shoulder barge. It can be pretty simple at first, and probably should be. I think that might be us. Thank you all for being a part of history. The real test of the value of this symposium is what comes out of it. The real test will be what gets taken back to the respective parishes here, represented here, what gets taken back, the people that are welcomed, the doors that are not just cracked open but forced open, open to their widest, so that people are able to be part of this community, so that other people are also able to see the reasons for the hope that is within us.